Okay, excellent. Thank you very much indeed for coming back so promptly. Our second session this morning focuses on the prison estate and its role in the rehabilitation revolution. It's entitled Prison Support: How Should Prisons Be Reformed to Cut Reoffending? And again, we have an absolutely first-class panel. To my immediate right is Nick Leader, who joined the public sector prison service as a prison officer in 1985. I'm told. Today, he's the director of Peterborough Prison, working for Sodexo Justice Services and, of course, at the centre of the innovative social impact bond scheme at the jail. To his right, Paul Baker, governor of Her Majesty's Prison Leeds, employed by the prison service. Leeds, of course, was supposed to be running one of these PBR pilots, but didn't quite happen that way. To my left, Colin Lambert has worked for St Giles Trust for almost 7 years, was involved in setting up the social impact bond thing in Peterborough. The Trust, of course, works with ex-offenders, and you currently manage, Colin, 5 resettlement projects in London, I think. Thank you. Nick Hardwick, to my far left, is Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons. Started his early career in the early 80s working with young offenders for NACRO, travelling from Centrepoint and then along Whitehall, a couple of stops there before stopping briefly at the Refugee Council and then the IPCC. Nick has experience of working on all kinds of streets and running all kinds of large organisations. So the question here is, how should prisons be reformed to cut reoffending? Nick Leader, what would you do?
Okay, I'd follow the model that we're adopting at Peterborough and just see how you can actually build on growing success.
Right, that's brief and to the point. Do you think there's actually how we bring prisons? I mean, if we're going to stop people reoffending, what we do inside the prison really matters, so that the product coming out is as ready for the world as they can be. Do you think, from what you've seen at Peterborough, the measures that you've taken, the steps you've taken to try and make your social impact bond model work, there are lessons for the whole estate?
I think there are, and I think for me it isn't just about actually what prison staff do in prisons, it's actually what prison staff can do outside of prison post-release, which is one of the developments we've actually recently introduced at Peterborough, as well as actually looking at how you can better link up with different partnerships. Partnerships that are formed effectively, especially if they meet the local agenda but actually build on some of the skills available from some of the national providers, I think are ways of actually ensuring that you don't just say that your way of working is the only way of working, but you actually look at what the individual needs are and you bring to the table the different skills that different organisations actually have.
Okay. And Paul, what do you think is the key?
Well, I think Nick raises a very good point, and I suppose the disappointing bit from the first session for me was that what there wasn't a lot of discussion around was the prisoners themselves, and actually what is it about an offender that makes them decide that at some point they don't want to keep doing this anymore. So I would say that lots of the work that my staff do and Nick's staff do in prison, the inside out bit is as important as the outside in, because lots of my staff, they will have known many of these offenders as they've grown up, quite frankly, and they will have talked to them, got to know them, tried to encourage them, and to get to the point where they would actually quite like to change. And it's that bit of getting them to the point when they'd quite like to change that I think prison service staff in the prison can do really, really well.
And that tie-up, the through-the-gate stuff, I mean, that seems to me where the weakness was. I remember meeting actually at Bristol a young man, 17 years old, and he said the thing that scared him most was being released.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. But interestingly, of course, in the prison service, we had a system, and we can sort of bend these rules now. I don't think my line manager's here, but when an offender goes out, there are quite strict rules about what contact you're allowed to have with offenders on release. So in theory, if one of my members of staff wanted to go out and meet someone for a coffee in Starbucks in a few weeks' time to see how they're doing, actually they are breaking the rules and they would have to submit a security information report, and that can't be right, because actually a lot of the men trust my staff a lot more than they would somebody from a community agency saying, come and see me every couple of weeks and we'll make sure you're doing okay. So we've had to try and think around that and actually try and encourage staff to go out and do that sort of work, because that's what matters and that's exactly what they need.
Nick Hardwick, you obviously look closely at the way prisons are operating. where do you think that the system can improve in terms of presenting people through the gates who are ready to be rehabilitated?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do, and my concern sometimes with the emphasis of what ministers say, is to remember the crucial role that prisons have got to play in this process. The work is going to start in prisons. And it was noteworthy. I wrote it down. Jeremy Wright said, our number one priority is how offenders are managed in the community. Of course, that's important, but how you manage them in prison is got to be a critical bit of the process. And I felt there was ambiguity in the consultation document about that. And when you put this to ministers, they say, no, we understand prisons are important. I'm sure they do, but I think there's a real risk that what happens in prisons isn't having sufficient emphasis. The second thing I wanted to say is, look, it's a pleasure to be here with Nick and Paul, because of the local prisons we've inspected, certainly since I've been Chief Inspector, these have been the two best local prisons. Right? And it's no accident that there were two local prisons that had rehabilitation and resettlement at the centre of what they did, because that affected the whole regime in the prison. It affected the whole way the prison worked. So I think, first of all, I'd say it's not too late. I think we ought to understand more about how those prisons work, about actually how effective they are in terms of reducing reoffending, and make sure the learning from both of those is fed back into the design of the new resettlement revolution. And I don't think that's been done enough. And they both, I think what we found, it may have changed. We were in Peterborough in 2011, in Leeds just at the beginning of this year, so I may be a bit out of date about Peterborough. But my sense was there were two different models in these two prisons. In Peterborough, our feeling was that in a sense, the resettlement provision was a sort of package that was brought into the prison. So it was something coming from outside in. Right? Whereas the model in Leeds was very different, where it's very much the prison going out. Now, Nick said that may have changed a bit in Peterborough since we were there. But I think it's worth evaluating those two approaches, because a critical thing about the whole process is, if you don't forget prisons, is about how you link up what happens in the community with what happens in a prison. And also deal with the question that's going to remain about what are you going to do with the guys in Peterborough who are being returned to a local area that's maybe in Lambeth or in South London. How's the through the gate going to stuff work with that? How's it going to work with Leeds when actually people aren't going, they're going the other side of the country to Manchester from there, because that's how the estates work. And you can do a bit to design the estate to make that more effective. But you are always, I can't see a situation in which you're not going to have people released to a home area that's some distance away from where the prison is located. And how that links up, I don't think has been sorted out yet.
You're hinting there that you think that prisons have been a little bit forgotten in this process.
I do think they have been. I've said this in our response. I think the language that's being used, I say if you prompt them, then they say, oh, no, prisons are central. But I think the language, I think what the Minister said today, what he said in his remark was, the number one priority is how offenders are managed in their community. And then there was a question from the audience that said, OK, what are you doing about prisons? And he goes, yes, prisons are important. I don't...
you don't think it's at the heart of their thinking?
Well, I think they forget. And I think there is a real danger in that. And what's important, I think what was important in both, if I talk about Leeds, because I remember that most clearly as there most recently, what was impressive about Leeds and Portsmouth is the way in which the whole prison was geared around the resettlement process. It wasn't just the functions that had resettlement and rehabilitation in their title. It was the way the wing officers spoke to people on the wings and reminded and reinforced some of the other work that was being done. It was the way the workshop trainers didn't just give people a skill, but help people through the issues around reliability and employability in that practical way. It's the way in which a toe-by-toe mentor doesn't just talk about literacy and numeracy, although that's important, will also actually mentor in other kinds of areas as well. And it's an area where like soft resettlement skills, like work with families, which is the most effective resettlement agency. On the whole, it's people's family, right? Who is it that gets somebody a job when they come out of prison in most cases? It's not St John's Trust, for the most part, it will be sometimes, but often it's their Uncle Billy who's got a building site and can give them a job on the site. Who is it that gives them accommodation when they haven't got somewhere to stay and their mum won't have them back? It's their sister, it's their nan. That's who puts them up. Who is it that makes sure they keep their drugs appointment? It's their mum who's on at them to go there and do it, right? So I'm not saying, of course, the family sometimes are the victims, sometimes they're part of the problem. I'm not saying it's a solution to everything. But we have to make sure that that soft, in a sense, resettlement work that's going on in a prison about making sure people maintain contact with their families, for instance, doesn't get squeezed out by the stuff that you can easily measure and judge. So I'm not saying, I think it's difficult to hear, give or take the emphasis a bit, what the minister said. Of course, what's not to like? A rehabilitation a revolution rehabilitation, about mentoring, all of those things is good stuff. But actually, that connection with what happens in prisons, joining that up, giving prisons their proper emphasis, I think it's something that needs more attention than it's had up to now.
And very, very, very briefly, if you would, Paul's point about actually prison staff effectively being prevented from going out and joining up in the community, that seems daft.
Well, I think you have to have some proper governance of that. But I mean, I think absolutely that you need to enable those sorts of things to happen. I think we need to make ironically, for a prison, I think we need to make the boundaries a bit more porous so people are working backwards and forwards through it. And so what the thing is focused on, right, is the prisoner and if you like, the victim, not in a sense the system, right? And I remember some of the problems that people have talked about in the health service is a good, someone summed it up for me, I thought very appositely about some of the stuff that came out of mid-staffs. We're saying that some people in the health service is they've lost sight of the patient, that the systems and procedures and the targets have made them lose sight of the patient. What we've got to make sure in this system is that we don't lose sight of, with all the talk about the payment mechanisms and the targets and the results, is that we don't lose sight of the offender or the victim.
Interesting. Making the boundaries between prisons and the wider community more porous, says the Chief Inspector. If anyone wants to tweet, they're more than... it's a rehab revolution hashtag.
That'll get me into trouble.
Colin, you work with thousands of ex-offenders, and do you think that when these people arrive at your door, are there things that you wish that the prison service had done better, given often the very short period of time they got to work with these troubled people?
Definitely. I mean, at the moment, the 5 projects I manage all work with offenders that are sentenced to under 12 months. And a lot of them only go to prison for like 28 days. So realistically, there's not a lot that the prison can do between the day they arrive and the day they leave. But what really needs to happen, and what I would say happened for me being an ex-offender, is there has to be some sort of positive change of attitude for that prisoner, but also if you have them a little bit longer, academically, things have to change so that when they're released back in the community, they're better able to take up the support that is offered in the community. The ones that we lose a lot at St. Giles are the ones that, when they go into prison for such a short time that nothing's changed. So we're getting them coming out the gate and they're exactly the same as they was 2 months ago. And we lose them. We may pick them up on Friday. By Monday, they're gone. We go back to the hotel where we left them on Monday. We might get a phone call from the prison saying that he's back. And the reason why that happens is because there's no change. He's come out to exactly the same problems, but he's come out with the same old tools that he's had to deal with those problems, which are absolutely no good to him. There has to be some sort of positive change for the inmate whilst they're in the prison, because it's not like when you're on a community order. When you're on a community order, you go along to your probation maybe once a week, or turn up to the centre where you're doing your work once a week, and you go and that's it. In prison, they have a captive audience where they have them every day, 7 days a week until they leave. That time should be used to change that inmate's attitude to his offending behaviour, to the role that he's been playing and he can play in the future within his community, because the prisons and the communities need to work together. So although St. Giles is very big on peer mentoring, also just mentors from the community are important. People from the church, people from local shops, because that's where the inmate is going to come back to. And maybe work-wise, and course-wise, it's very important that maybe the courses and the training that's given in prison, maybe it should be geared towards what is the employment opportunities that are available in the community where this inmate is going back to.
But if we're going to be including now in this prisoners on short sentences, so they may only have gone to prison for 3 months, 6 months, something like that. Actually, the prison has got very little time to really work with them. And isn't that ultimately the great difficulty that actually, we'll hear what you have to say in a second, but I mean, that actually prisons, they really don't have very long to give them training and skills and all the rest, and education and so on. They're in and they're out again.
Yeah, I would say that under 12-month sentences are, in most cases, are totally ineffective. All they do, they just remove the problem for a short space of time and then put the problem back.
Do you welcome the fact that that group is now going to have some kind of probation support under this new system?
Yeah. I welcome that they're going to have some support. I don't know if, although probation can play a part of it, I don't know if probation is the answer, because it takes more than just the offender turning up once a week, asking him, is he okay? He says, yeah, you tick the box, okay, give him another appointment for next week. It takes more than that. There has to be some real on-the-ground practical help that shows that offender how he can change it. It's not about, us sitting here and saying what can be done. It's about showing that offender how to be a part of that, how to actually access that and take it up. And for me as an offender, I first went to prison when there was Boolstall, and I know a lot of you here might not remember Boolstall, but I first went to prison when I went to Boolstall, and I swore I would never go back. But where I think I fell down was on release, I went back to the same people, the same problems, nothing had changed. And I subsequently went back maybe 4 or 5 times after that, and all that happened was the sentences increased, my willingness to maybe want to change got more, but every time I got it wrong. And I think what finally came together was that when I was in Wandsworth the last time, what was given to me was opportunity. I got a real opportunity to say, you know what, I can change my life. I got a proper qualification that I could use when I came outside to get into a job. Most qualifications in prison are aimed too low. They're no good for getting into employment when you come out. All it means is that you're going to have to go in further training. But in prisons, you're not told this. You're told to do the bricklaying level 2 and you're fine. You'll be able to go and be a brickie. But you can't get on site with it. So you need to have qualifications aimed where the offender can use it to get into paid employment.
And what you're doing in conjunction with Peterborough, do you feel you've made progress in improving that kind of link-up between the real world and the world inside?
Oh, definitely. I mean...
And what are the things that you do there
okay.
you think should do everywhere?
Okay, so we've introduced our peer advisor, peer mentor scheme where they study for their NVQ level 3 in advice and guidance. Now, that level 3, it can be used to give advice and guidance in any field. So
Sorry, just because this is for offenders who might be able to become a mentor afterwards. So you effectively train them to be mentors.
To be mentors. Also, the good thing about Peterborough is about reducing reoffending. So when we first started, we had some clients that pick them up on Monday, Friday, they're back on Monday. 2 weeks later, they're released on Friday, they're back on Monday. And this went on and on. And what we realised was that the crimes that these people were committing was things like breach of their ASBO. And to send him to prison for 28 days where he spends 14, nothing was going to change. So we kind of maybe spoke to the courts and the police and said, look, instead of you arresting this man, taking him to court and him going back for 14 days, phone us. We'll come and get him from the police station. And what we did with some of them was, first of all, find them accommodation. So now, instead of drinking and being a nuisance in the town centre, he can do that at home. Some of them, we started to give them... well, he can. Nobody minds a nuisance in his own house. But what that did was that reduced the amount of times he was arrested, the amount of times that he ended up having to go through the court, and the amount of times that Nick saw him coming back into his prison. From there, we managed to get him some voluntary work at our office. From there, we managed to get him maybe a job doing something across the road, in the shop across the road. And it's about those little steps. We built those little steps with him.
Right. Okay. Well, let's take some questions from the floor now. Well, yes, you can have another go, and one here. So they're both this side. Sorry, I've just failed this time. I've tried. So, lady at the front here. Sorry, did I catch you out then by doing that? Yes, just lady at the front. That's good. And then there's a lady there. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not known for being quiet and missing opportunities.
No, I got that idea.
There was a few things said that I'd just like to sort of pick up on and ask about. Firstly, the in-prison stuff. As I understand it, from the consultation document, the budget to support resettlement activity for short sentence prisoners that is currently within custody will be in scope of this competition. Therefore, as part of this competition, if it actually gets to a competition, then there is scope for providers not to deliver an in-reach or an outreach service, but to become a core part of the prison activity. And I really get frustrated when people say 28 days isn't long enough. Day one, first night, should be the beginning of the journey the offender takes. Doesn't matter whether it's in custody, wherever, but day one is when that journey begins, and it should be carried all the way through. We do, yes. So I think that's really important. So I'd welcome particularly Paul's views on that as to what that means. And then secondly, the point on mentors. And again, it's something I'd like to understand because I failed to do this as part of the consultation. There's approximately 87,000 prisoners in jail at the moment. The aspiration is for all of them to have a mentor. The aspiration now is obviously for some of them to be paid mentors as well. For those that are paid, fine, but where is the budget going to come from to support them paid mentors?
It's going to come from places like G4S, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we've got good experience of being able to manage volunteers. Also...
I wasn't laughing.
Lessons learned, probably the best experience of a lessons learned organisation. And then, but secondly, for those that aren't going to be paid volunteers or who are going to be volunteer mentors, then where are these people that can give up 40 hours a week and have sufficient budget at home to be able to give up them hours to become mentors? So whilst I absolutely support the need for mentors, where are they going to come from?
Well, we had that question earlier as well. So, yes, it's there.
Vicky Hellier-Cardwell, Criminal Justice Alliance. In the session this morning, we touched a bit on the mandatory licence conditions for short sentence prisoners. So it looks like the government's going to create, through legislation, a new short sentence that's got a bit of time in custody, possibly a few weeks, months, we don't know, followed by a period of kind of mandatory rehabilitation in the community. Do the panel think it's necessary to do that? Because obviously Peterborough's voluntary engagement, I think you've got 70% of people engaging. So is it necessary to introduce that new short sentence to achieve the reduction reoffending? And is there a potential danger of the ASBO effect that we've talked about, which is, if you've got a lot of conditions, is this a group who are likely to breach and end up back in custody for another short sentence?
Okay, Paul Baker, on Debbie's point, 28 days, you should start working with them on day one. I'm sure you're going to say that you do.
We do. I think it's a really important point because I've always been someone that has been quite passionate about short sentenced offenders, mostly because I sort of came into a service 15 years ago where most of the resources that were given to offenders to help them keep coming back to prison were given to those people that needed to get parole. So that was people serving over 4 years. And there was always this perverse incentive to keep offending, to get longer and longer sentences until you get to the point at which you get all the help to not keep coming back. And I always thought that was a bit nuts, quite frankly. So I've always, at my previous establishment, Norwich and now at Leeds, tried to do it the other way around and say that there are quite a number of men who are getting frequent short sentences with good reason. When you talk to magistrates, they are at the end of their tether with some of these men, and some people say, you shouldn't just get 2 weeks. Well, actually, I don't really know what else magistrates are meant to do. And I suppose as a member of the public, I sort of think it's all right that bloke comes to prison, actually. And what I'd also say about short sentence offenders is, as Debbie said, the journey begins on day one, actually. And in my experience, 15 years now of talking to offenders, and those that say, you know what, I've had enough, that isn't necessarily in the middle of a 2, 3, 4 or 5 year sentence. It can be day one of the 15th time they've come back and they say, you know what, I've had enough, Governor, actually. And I've known men, I knew a prisoner who said...
What do you do with them, though? On that day one, what can you actually do?
Well, the first thing we do is they're in our first night centre, and we have prisoner mentors who go down and talk to them. So we have some men who are on my resettlement wing who actually get chances that other prisoners typically think they won't get. So a lot of offenders will say, no point me trying to change, can't get a job. I can say at Leeds, I release up to 15 men a day going into work, and then they come back. So I can say with my mentors who do that, who go down to the first night centre, you do have a chance to get a job here, actually. We have got shelter who can help you get somewhere to live. We have got drug recovery so you can get off drugs. So we try and take away all their excuses not to reoffend. I think the important bit is that when they get out, as has been said, that's the important bit. And that's the bit that we were hoping with PBR, we'd have been working with some of these companies to actually do the proper follow-up through the gate stuff, because I think the service that we provide in Leeds is exceptionally good, and it would only be enhanced by work that we could hopefully do in the community going forward.
And Nick, Leader, this question about people on short sentences and the ASBO effect, the worry is that actually they will just not be able to manage. You put them on probation, you introduce that group into it, you're just going to have an endless round of people coming back because they've breached the system that you've put in place.
Well, I think we know that there are a lot of people that are coming back, and so what you have to do is work out what you can do differently. And I think if you look at the project that's been run through social finance at Peterborough, they've brought things that are different to the table. So points that Colin mentioned, they train mentors, they're trained to MVQ level 3. Actually, 2 have been trained up to MVQ level 4. You give them a sense of confidence to be able to motivate and deal with other offenders a lot more professionally than I've seen happen in some of the other prisons. So Paul's point about actually having peer champions, peer support workers, they start an assessment, they do an assessment within 2 or 3 days, there's then a follow-on assessment done by caseworkers from the likes of St Giles Trust who can add a layer of understanding about what's going on. And this work's happening with short-termers, serving less than 28 days, a lot of them, before that person's even released. So you're building up an information base, you're working out what people's risks are, and some of the innovation funding that the One Service has brought into the table, it actually has got a budget which it allows it to...
One Service being the
provider of the actual payment by result service within Peterborough. They've got the ability to spot purchase, for instance, for individual needs. So if someone's got a particular problem, rather than saying that you can only get an X service, you actually allow the provider to actually come up with some other options that can make a difference. And there was one lad, and I just really want to go through one of the prisoners that has been released recently. His name's Gareth. He'd been convicted 231 times. He'd been in prison 92 times. Through the One Service, he's actually got 10 agencies involved with providing support. He's had 271 support sessions, and in the last month, he's just done his first 6 months out of prison for the last 14 years. And he's actually had his first Christmas outside of prison for the first 14 years. Now, something has happened to make him change. The service has actually come in. He's a very complex offender, but it can show that if you want to do something and you can get underneath the skin of these people, they want to change as well. And our challenge is to try to make sure that we bring that mixture of ideas and the actual hope to offenders that previously I think have been left behind. And I'm absolutely confident that's what changes in the way of delivering these services can provide.
And very briefly, on the mentors point, do you pay your mentors or are they volunteers?
We've got prisoner mentors, which are just paid very low prison
while
wages
they're inside.
Whilst they're inside, yes. But some of those people, for instance, one of them is now working for St Giles. So he was trained. He actually did work inside and outside the prison whilst he's at Peterborough. He's moved on. He's actually now got paid employment with St Giles. We've also got other options that we're looking at, because the project at Peterborough only applies to those male offenders serving less than 12 months. Well, we've got an awful lot of other offenders. So we've got an agency called Friends of Peterborough Prison. It's a charity, and they provide 40 volunteers that work within the prison on a daily basis.
And they're volunteers, are they?
They're volunteers. They provide support in education and mother and baby units, and they're a sort of a group that we ought to be able to link up with and say, well, if you are going to work with these offenders, is there something else that we can do to also supplement the use of those charities on release? And certainly for us, they're the opportunities that we think, if you get local buy-in, there is an awful lot of people out there that will find the hours to actually provide support to a growing number of people that are going to their communities. And if you don't change them, they just keep on reoffending.
Nick Hardwick, on this question of the new of people on those under 12-month sentences being part of the probation service for the first time, do you think this is a welcome development, or do you worry about the ASBO effect?
Well, I think that the implication in the earlier session, there was some talk around discretion around that. So I think discretion is going to be very important. So I do think it's reasonable to say, for instance, that somebody who, for instance, has a drug problem and they start some work on that while they're in prison should be required. There will be some cases where it's reasonable to require them to continue it after they leave. And you can think of other examples where I think it is reasonable to say, look, you have to keep this appointment, you have to turn up here. I don't think that's an unreasonable imposition. But I also think there are some people who actually that is going to be counterproductive, because you don't think, because actually what may be best for them is to move to a different bit of the country and start a clean slate away from some of the influences that got them into trouble beforehand. And there's also a risk for people, I think sometimes they just need to get clear of the criminal justice system, because all the people around that create a kind of damaging culture. So I think, so I don't have a problem with it in principle, provided that it's not overused and there is discretion to sentences in particular about how that should work. I don't think...
Is that a sentence that we should say at the point where we send someone down, this is somebody who ought to have a mandatory and this is a discretion?
Well, that would be one way of doing it. I think it's something that needs to be explored kind of more carefully, and I don't want to kind of entrap people in the criminal justice system when actually the best thing for them might be to clear it. But I wouldn't rule it out altogether.
Yes. Can I ask your view on this? I mean, as a magistrate, would you welcome the opportunity to say to somebody you're sentencing, perhaps to 3 months, 6 months, I don't think this person should have mandatory...
I don't think we could do that at that stage unless it was very clear, but it's going to be a decision for the governor, basically, I would guess.
Right.
But I'm still a little bit foggy about the whole question of whether these people will be supervised voluntarily or whether they can be breached by the providers if things go wrong.
Debbie, can you help on that? Well, yeah.
I think there's lots of debate about this at the moment.
Microphone, thanks.
There's lots of debate about this at the moment. It was one of the key questions of the consultation as to whether that flexibility in sentencing would be there, and whether the under 12 months specifically should be under a statutory licence. And I think if they are going to be, then it needs to be looked at very carefully. There's lots of evidence to suggest that if they engage voluntarily, then you have more effect on the ability for that individual to change.
Sure, but it might be the ones who don't do it that you really want to get to.
But exactly. I mean, when we look at the whole of all the under 12 months, those that are sentenced, within 5 years, 90% of them reoffend anyway. So we've got to do something different. So maybe it is time to try a statutory element that we can engage with.
Let's take some more questions. I saw a gentleman down the front here. Was it you still want to ask your question there? And we'll take this gentleman here. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Chris Little. I was one of the designers of Peterborough Prison. I just want to talk about the points that were made earlier, I think very well, about the first night and the first day being really important. When we did the Peterborough and worked out the personal custody plan approach, which influenced the design of the building, we thought very much about the point of entry, the first day, the first experience, really, because you all know how much...
When you say design, you mean the actual physical fabric of the prison?
Yes. So you all know how much our buildings shape us quite considerably, so obviously it's very important. And what I don't quite get at the moment is, where is the link between the voluntary or paid services on a PBR basis in the public and the private estate, and the impact on that first night, that first impression? Or is that something that we think can be, as we've heard, well taken care of within the prison, and really the input of those other elements is actually pre-release or later on? I just like to understand that.
Absolutely. Gentleman here.
So Jonathan Flory from Social Finance. I think Nick Leader articulated very well the sense of partnership at Peterborough Prison and the personal investment that he's made in making sure that this is a partnership, it is aligned, it is joined up. And it's very important, I think, in our view, that when an individual does come into prison, you start a personal action plan so that at the gates there is some specific actions which are appropriate for that individual. So it may be a short time, but it's very important. I think one of the challenges, and perhaps a question to the panel about the new structures, is how does one motivate public sector prison governors to engage with perhaps private sector providers or even voluntary providers in a way that requires them to offer access into their prisons, to embrace a lot of people coming in and out talking to their offenders, but perhaps without the financial incentives for them to do so.
Okay. Well, actually, you had a question as well, and since you're so...
Actually, mine was absolutely... Sorry, Harriet Sargent. I write reports for the Centre for Policy Studies, during which I actually befriended a particular South London gang. And my question was exactly that one, was how do we motivate... I've seen how effective prisons are with these boys, and how do we motivate all prison governors so they are doing the same as these two here? And why aren't they doing the same as these two here?
Okay. Colin, that first night that you go into a prison, we've heard from Chris about the importance of the design of the prison, but it's also about who gets access to you at that point. I mean, how would you design the first night for perhaps a prisoner who's arrived for the very first sentence?
I think, especially for a short-term prisoner, like let's take the 28-day scenario, I think that on that first, when we say first night, there's not the first 24 hours, let's say. I think within that first 24 hours, if there are organisations or agencies that are going to be working with that prisoner when he's released in 14 days' time, they should be part of that first 24 hours. So...
is that not... I mean, it's just complicated to get everyone in the room at the same time. I mean, practically, can you really do that?
I would say it's not that complicated. For me, I'm an ex-offender who's managed to change my life. Now, I would have thought that prisons would welcome me coming into the prison as an example to the other prisoners. But instead of that, it's exactly the opposite. I find it really hard, unless it's a prison like Peterborough that is really supportive, I find it really hard. I'm not asking nobody to give me keys. I don't want keys to walk around the prison.
No,
you know,
I can see that.
And any self-respecting ex-offender wouldn't want keys. You know, but I would just like to be able to get into that first night suite and be able to, you know, maybe sit down with him and compile a support plan about what's going to happen over the next 14 days whilst you're in prison, and then what's going to carry on happening when you get released. Okay. And we should be a part of that. Whatever agency is going to work with him in the community should be a part of that whole process.
Nick Hardwick, is that practical?
Well, it'd be practical in some places. I mean, I think you have to be a bit elastic by what you mean the first night. I mean, for some people, actually just getting their head around the prison experience and what they're going to be doing in the next few hours will be top of their priorities. And if you bombard them with too much information early on, it's kind of wasted.
They're only in there for 28 days.
No, well, okay. No, I mean, I'm not talking about a long time, but you need to allow the experienced people that are there to do what's kind of best for those circumstances. You know? Then I don't see why you shouldn't be able to do the kind of thing that you were talking, that Colin was talking about, but actually the design of some prisons. If you talk about some of the old Victorian prisons, that there is a real problem. There's also a problem with the sheer number of people going through in some senses. I mean, Wormwood Scrubs, I think I'm correct in saying that Wormwood Scrubs has 1,200 people a week going through its reception. Right? So if you're trying to kind of manage that flow of people, right, you're going to have to, you need pretty good systems if you're going to deal with that kind of official. Some of those are going backwards and forwards to court. Some of those, a lot of remand prisoners you've got to deal with. So it's not an easy thing to do. But I think Harriet's point was right. I think up to now, it's what I think is good about the ministerial priority this has got. I think up to now, my experience has been pretty low on a lot of governance priorities. I think it's kind of, once you've done everything else, then you start to think about rehabilitation. And that's why, you do see, what's significant about Peterborough and Leeds is about how unusual they are. Right? They are by far and away, a long way, the best we see. Often we'll see local prisons where this isn't really happening in any size, shape or description. I don't think it's a kind of public or private thing, because you've got two examples here, public and private prisons that deliver well. So I think you do have to provide incentive for people. I think you do have to push up people's agenda. And that's why I think it's dangerous if the kind of ministerial rhetoric is ambiguous about this. I think you've got to keep hammering the message home. Actually, if you are a governor, however we judge you, whether it's on payment by results, whether it's your performance appraisal or whatever, what you're doing about resettlement and rehabilitation, how successful you are at that, is a key criteria. And then other thing comes in behind that.
Okay, Paul Baker, this question of how you motivate public sector governors like yourself to engage. You will know other people who run other prisons who would be less enthusiastic than you are.
No.
Well,
I mean, it certainly isn't financial, and I'm sure I'd speak for Nick, and it wouldn't ever be financial for us, because when we joined the service, and I've known Nick many years, we join because actually we go back to we want to make a difference and we want to do the right thing. And I think the only comment I would make is the service over the last 10, 15 years, I suppose, slipped a bit into performance managing on a number of different key performance targets, where I think in the middle of it we sometimes lost sight of actually what we're here for. And I think what I've tried to do at Leeds is just to say, actually, what's important, what matters most, why did I join the job? And as governor, you have it in your gift to be able to try and deliver some of your own personal ambition and what you felt was the right thing to do. So I suppose it has been something that I've personally tried to lead on. I think a lot of governors have the same philosophy, and I think the service has recognised that now, to its credit.
But Colin can't get in. I mean,
well,
he was in a prison and would like to
come
get
to
out.
mind.
Now he can't get back in again. I mean, that's wrong, isn't it? I mean,
well, again, it goes back to sometimes there are some strict, antiquated rules that say, you shouldn't employ. There's strict vetting for employing ex-offenders, and should you be allowed to employ them? And I think increasingly we're just having to understand that we don't live in a black and white world anymore. And we're now trying to change things and to do things differently. And to do that, you have to, as one governor once said to me, understand that rules are for the guidance of the wise and the blind obedience of fools, which is pretty much how I run my prison. So I don't break rules. Anyone who's here from Noms, Lucy? But actually, I'm willing to sort of push boundaries. And certainly the advantage for me of being involved in the PBR discussions for 12 months, although we didn't actually go to pilot, was it opened up my thinking. And I think more of those discussions where governors can be freed up, we can open up our thinking, we can be encouraged to take measured risks. That's what's needed, I think, for prisons to change.
Okay, Nick Leader, you started obviously in the public sector prison service. You know the service intimately. How can we convince, public sector prison governors and others that actually it's their advantage to invite, whether it be Colin or a private company in and others, particularly, they want to control things behind their walls, of course.
I think that last point actually is a fairly interesting one. Prison governors do like to be in control of what's actually their remit, and I'd say that's probably the same for me as a prison director. I think the reasons why the relationships worked at Peterborough, and I think it would work whether I was a governor of a public sector or a private sector prison, is what Paul said. It's the right thing to do. I think we've shown at Peterborough we're stronger working together than we are working apart. And actually, some of the overseeing structures, although we're a private sector prison, our contract is overseen by the Ministry of Justice. So I think you can come up with reasons why you can't do things, but instead at Peterborough what we try and do is look at reasons why we can do things if it looks like it will bring some extra benefit. If it doesn't, and there have been some times where we've had some disagreement about where that benefit will lie, then you need to have the maturity to actually accept that sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong, but create an environment which allows you to carry on changing. I think the thing for me that one service have brought into Peterborough that is significantly different and better than I managed to achieve in the public sector was an ability to manage some of the voluntary and community sector agencies in a much more flexible and responsive fashion.
Within the rules?
Within the rules, because the rules actually, as Paul said, you can understand the rules, it's actually how you apply them. The same rules apply at Peterborough as do at Leeds, as do at other prisons. It's just actually how you get the authority to bring about change. So I have got ex-offenders working at Peterborough talking at full staff meetings, telling staff about the benefit of actually working with the one service, and actually having 200 staff listen to one prisoner saying, actually, this is who I am. I've actually now gone out, I've come back, I'm actually a personnel that's outside of prison, and you need to carry on helping people. That's a very powerful motivator for staff to enable them to understand the benefits of working with offenders in a much more humane and almost personable way of working. So I think it's down for us to actually work out ways of how we can work differently together, rather than just sit back and say we can't do that because some interpretation of the rules prevent us from moving further forward.
All right, we'll take 2 more quick questions and then we'll have some. Lady there, lady there.
Isabelle Laurent, founding trustee of RAPT, Rehabilitation for Addicted Prisoners Trust. You've mentioned drug offenders, but you haven't mentioned the role of drug-free wings, full-scale drug treatment in prisons. And I would note potentially the role of what I was shocked to discover, retoxing, to send people out of prison so that they were less likely to die, rather than actually ensuring that they went on to continue leading drug-free lives with additional help.
Okay, very interesting question. Lady there.
I'm Sarah Llewellyn from the Barrow Cadbury Trust. We're initial investors in the Peterborough SIB. Mine was a point, really, in relation to the exchange we've just had about public sector prison governors, which is to point people in the direction of the University of Cambridge's Criminology Department's recent piece of work, which, across a whole range of measures, demonstrates quite clearly that the very best prisons are and the very worst are both to be found in the private and the public sector. So it's not a matter of specifically needing to target public sector prison governors.
Okay, because that wasn't a question, and the gentleman here is very keen to ask one. We'll just take this one here and then... Hold on one sec, microphone.
My name's Billy Steele, and I should declare, in fact, that I myself am an alcoholic. I have been sober for over 30 years, so... It seems to me that everybody has completely missed the whole point of the thing, which is that the problem is one of addiction. And as long as addiction is left untreated, prisoners will reoffend. Nothing I've learned in the last 30 years has convinced me otherwise that you cannot recover from alcoholism or drug addiction without first becoming abstinent. Now, part of the problem goes back to doctors and medicine, whose default treatments for drug addiction, like heroin, is methadone substitution, which itself is another narcotic. And in the case of alcoholism, it's either beseeching everybody to control their drinking and drink within the statutory guidelines, or else also with prescribed medication.
Question.
Why are the prisons awash with drugs and alcohol?
Okay.
And why do doctors prescribe methadone? The poor prisoners coming out, and I know lots of them through the work that I do, they will never recover without first of all becoming abstinent.
All right, I'm going to move. I met a prisoner 6 months ago who told me how he spat out his methadone. He secretly put it in his mouth and then spat it out because he wanted to withdraw so much, and the prison wouldn't countenance it. Paul Baker, drug-free wings, retoxing, prisoners unable to actually come off drugs when they want to. Abstinence sort of becoming second to the management of drugs and so on. I mean, is that a picture that's familiar to you?
No. I mean, Leeds Prison is a place
retox, out of interest, do you retox?
I think we might. It would depend on a doctor, so it's a clinical decision, so I don't get involved in it. What we've done in the prison, though, is say that our total belief is in abstinence, actually, because I've certainly met prisoners, and I met one a few months ago down in my reception, and when he was having his drug screen, said... he takes 18 mils of methadone a day, which is a lot. He had a £100 a day habit for crack, £100 a day habit for heroin, and he drank 4 cans of special brew a day. And quite frankly, 4 cans of special brew would kill me. And And he was a classic case of somebody where I've always believed that abstinence is the right way to do it. So at Leeds we set up a drug recovery wing and a drug-free wing, and we have 12-step smart recovery groups. And, prisons aren't awash with drugs. There's a bit of a myth that, they are. Some prisons have higher drug rates than others. Ours has reduced percentage MDT rate, mandatory drug testing rate, has fallen by 2/3. Number of prisoners on methadone.
From what to what?
It was in the 20s, and it's now down to usually 7 or 8%. Numbers of prisoners on methadone in 2 years has fallen from 40% when I first got there to now about 17%. So, it can be done, and a lot of governors are on that journey. It's not just me. And now treatment guidelines are saying you need to move towards recovery, and that is firmly on our agenda.
Right. Nick Leader, what do you think?
Same response in terms of the idea of detoxing people in the first instance, and then actually providing prisoners with the environment that will actually keep them off drugs is very clearly our priority. That's a change from a previous regime where we would actually quite regularly continue people on methadone. There's a clear movement from what the policy of dealing with people has been over the last 2 years. Now very much our targets are in line with those of the community provider. So for instance we work very closely to Aspire, who are Peterborough's community a drug service provider. If they are dealing with a prisoner outside a prison and they've managed to get them off drugs, it's actually in our interest to make sure that we maintain their progress for recovery when they come into prison. And similarly, when we're actually releasing people, we're much more aligned now to actually ensure that we provide them access to support outside the prison that will allow them to maintain the same progress.
Do you retox?
Only if in very rare occasions where a person might be in prison for such a short period of time, it will be seen as a safe way of actually discharging that prisoner, but it would only be if that's what the GP felt that was the appropriate thing to do.
Colin?
What I used to really find strange about the whole methadone thing in prison was that some people go on what they call a maintenance script, which is they give them the same amount of methadone daily and that's never going to be reduced. And for me, that just seems a little bit strange. The point, anybody who has an addiction, whether it be alcohol or drugs, who comes into prison, I think the prison have a duty in whatever small time they have with that person to help reduce that person's dependency on drugs. If they have long enough, then they should be aiming to stop that person's dependency on drugs, because 99 times out of 100, it's their dependency on drugs that is driving their reoffending. So if you can stop their dependency on drugs, you may not totally stop their reoffending, but you will greatly reduce it. And I think that should be the aim when they come in, that there should be a plan set, that this is how we're going to work with this person, and by this time we are going to aim to get this person completely off drugs. And then we're going to look at a plan for when he comes into the community, how are we going to maintain that, because it's a little bit...
I've met so many drugs workers who would say actually maintenance is key to success. You can manage people's chaotic lives far better by maintaining them at a certain level over perhaps really quite a long period. And that if you don't do that, actually you create the chaos that all of this we're trying to avoid.
Well, that could be the case with some people, but I just think that, it's like if you've got a man in prison that's been there a while, and in prison they make hooch, which is like prison alcohol, and that's what he's been drinking. On release, what he's going to want is a can of proper beer or a can of a bottle of whiskey. To me, it's the same with maintenance. You've got him on this methadone, which isn't really what he wants. What he really wants is some heroin. But you kept him on this methadone, and what we find with the clients that we meet at the gate, even though they've been on a maintenance script, if we take our eye off them, for a split second on the first couple of days out, they're going to go and buy some heroin. They will still go along to the chemist and get their methadone, but once they get a bit of money in their hand, they're going to want to buy the real thing. And we should be taking them away from that.
Okay, Nick Hardwick.
I agree with a lot of what's been said, actually. I think that, first of all, we should move to a kind of a reduction and eventually a kind of stopping people taking intensive drugs. I think how you do that depends on the individual. I think abstinence works for some. I think others need a more staged process. I think putting someone on an abstinence regime when they've only got a couple of weeks in the prison isn't going to work. So I think you have to take medical advice. And I think our view is that the kind of drug treatment programs they've now got in prisons are much improved from what was the case a number of years ago. I think treatment now, whether it's abstinence or whether it's some stage reduction, isn't enough in itself. I think you've also got to tackle supply, right? And that doesn't just mean stuff that's, in a sense, illegal drugs being brought into the prison one way or another. It also means, I think, now a better grip on poor prescribing practice, where prescribed medicines in some prisons are being doled out like Smarties and traded and bullied for and creating kind of havoc. So I think you've got to tackle supply and you've got to tackle demand kind of hand in hand. And that's what I'm surprised by the number of places we go to where that doesn't seem to be a priority and is a really lax approach. Again, happy to say that wasn't the case in either Leeds or Peterborough, but I think you need to do both those things.
Everybody's happy up here. Ladies and gentlemen, we've eaten into the lunch break when we should have been eating lunch, so apologies for that. But it's been a really fascinating discussion. We've come back, I think, at about, say, 1:50-ish. Would you like to show your appreciation?